Hello and happy holidays. Whether you celebrate Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, or Yule, I hope you're having a wonderful holiday season. This video is all about things that I think people should know about paganism. So whether you know absolutely nothing about paganism or whether you've been pagan all your life, I'm glad you stopped by and I hope you find this video helpful and informative. Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Madeline, and here on this channel we make videos about LGBT issues and mental health. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, consider subscribing. As you may have guessed from the title though, this video isn't about LGBT issues or mental health. It's actually about religion and spirituality, as this video is part of my final for one of my divinity school courses. It's definitely going to be a little bit different than my usual content, especially if you're a newer subscriber, but hopefully you'll still enjoy this video and learn something from it. So the idea for this video actually started on TikTok. An account with the username @PastorDante posted a TikTok where he, as a Christian pastor, decided that he wanted to engage in dialogue with the pagan community, specifically around things that we as pagans want Christians to know about paganism. Unfortunately, he's since deleted his TikToks, but I figured I could still make a YouTube video in response, especially because I know how to make YouTube videos and I vastly prefer watching TikToks to making TikToks. I was originally going to title this video 10 Things I Want Christians to Know About Paganism, but then I realized we're a small religion. The Pew Research Center estimates that there are just under 1 million pagans living in the US according to a 2014 survey, and so because we're a small religion, I figured there's probably a lot of people of different religions who don't know very much about paganism. So with that in mind, I wanted this video to address everyone who might want to know more about paganism. Before we dive in, I wanted to add a disclaimer that I still consider myself to be a fairly new pagan. I've been practicing for about 5 years now, and while I'm determined to give you the best information possible, I don't claim to be an expert. Furthermore, I am just one pagan, and I don't claim to speak on behalf of all pagans. All that being said, let's get started with number one, which is that paganism isn't a singular religious tradition. As a pagan, it's not uncommon for people to ask me, what do pagans believe? But the problem with that question is that paganism is best understood as an umbrella term for many different religious traditions. And to be clear, this isn't the same as how Christianity has thousands of different denominations that disagree here or there but largely agree on most of the same things. These are completely different religions that share a few things in common, but otherwise orient around religion completely differently. To use an analogy from the LGBT community, since this is largely a queer-focused channel, the label of non-binary is a standalone identity all on its own, but it also encompasses other identities such as agender, genderqueer, genderfluid, demigirl, demiboy, etc., each of which is a separate non-binary identity that orients around gender completely differently. Likewise, the label of paganism encompasses Wicca, Druidry, Thelema, Hellenism, Kemetism, Asatru, Reclaiming, and many more, each with their own unique beliefs and practices. So if you're speaking to a pagan and you want to know more about their religious beliefs, you might ask them, what tradition do you belong to? Or, can you tell me more about your beliefs? You'll likely get more of an answer that way than if you ask them a generalized question about what all pagans collectively believe. Also, if you want more information about some of the things that pagans share in common, I've left a video in the description from one of my favorite pagan YouTubers who talks about just that. Next, I want to talk about one thing that most pagan paths share in common, which is that pagan religions tend to be earth-centered and in many ways nature-worshipping. For example, Wiccans, Druids, and some eclectic pagans, myself included, follow the Wheel of the Year, which is a cycle of holy days that revolves around the changing of the seasons and the cycles of nature. Likewise, some pagans will organize their spell work around the cycles of the moon, reserving certain magic for when the moon is full, waning, waxing, or new. This veneration of the earth also extends to matters that aren't strictly religious, such as environmentalism and animal rights activism. There are some pagans who don't identify as belonging to an earth-centered religion, and because there's so much diversity within paganism, there are bound to be exceptions to all of the things I mentioned in this video, but by and large, pagans regard the earth as sacred and treat her as such. The third thing I want to talk about in this video is that in addition to revering the earth, pagans also honor the divine feminine. I think a lot of us, at least in the West, learn to think of God as an old man in the sky with a long white beard. And within Christianity, you often hear about God the Father and God the Son, but there's less mention of God as mother or daughter. Pagans, on the other hand, tend to believe that the divine masculine and the divine feminine need to be honored, and we often do so by working with or worshipping goddesses such as Isis or Artemis or Freya or Rhiannon, or by honoring the divine feminine within ourselves. And yes, that goes for men within the pagan community as well. There's masculinity and femininity within everybody, and it doesn't do anybody any good to deny parts of ourselves. Many of us worship nature and the divine feminine, but contrary to popular belief, the overwhelming majority of us do not worship Satan, which is the fourth thing that I want to talk about in this video. Years ago, back when I still identified as Christian, I was having a conversation with someone and somehow we got on the topic of Wicca. And she said, you know, Wiccans worship the devil. And I had done some research into Wicca just out of curiosity, and I informed her that that wasn't the case. And she said, well, that's what they say, but really, they do. It's been a misconception for centuries that pagans and witches work with Satan. I mean, just look at the Salem witch trials. But Satan is an Abrahamic concept, and most pagans emphasize the fact that we belong to a non-Abrahamic tradition. In other words, a lot of us don't work with the Abrahamic deity, and by extension, we also don't work with his adversary. Now, there are Luciferians and Satanists who work with Satan or Lucifer, or at least the concept of Satan or Lucifer, and they would be considered pagan as well. So I can't make a blanket statement and say that there aren't any pagans that worship the devil. But as I mentioned earlier, if you want to know what a pagan believes, it's best to just ask them, and it's also best to not assume that they work with the devil, because they probably don't. Also, just want to clarify that there's absolutely nothing wrong with being a Satanist or a Luciferian. It's a totally valid and meaningful path. It's just not representative of paganism as a whole. Anyway, the fifth thing that I want to talk about is something that you might already know, but it's a misconception that I've run into before, and it's actually a misconception that's found in the Bible, so I wanted to clear it up, which is that pagans do not worship idols. There's a verse in Deuteronomy that talks about man-made gods of wood and stone, and it speaks to a belief that the idols are the gods that pagans are praying to. Now, it's not uncommon for pagans to have figurines of the gods that we worship. We'll put them on our altars, pray in front of them, what have you. But the figurines or idols or whatever you want to call them, I'm pretty sure that none of us actually believe that they themselves are the gods. They're figures that represent the gods that we worship, but they aren't actually the gods themselves. So I grew up in a Lutheran church, and at the beginning and end of every service, a person called a crucifer would carry a pole with a cross on top of it in and out of the sanctuary. And it was customary for people to bow before the cross because it symbolized Jesus, but nobody was actually worshiping the cross itself. It was just a symbol that represented Jesus, the deity who they were worshipping. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully I didn't over-explain it too much. I was just taken aback the first time someone told me that they believed my gods were made of wood and stone. Not because I was offended, but just because it didn't make sense to me. The sixth thing that I'd like to mention is that magic is a common element within paganism. Many pagans are also witches, though not all pagans are witches, and not all witches identify as pagan. Also, just as a side note, most pagans consider witch to be a gender-neutral term. It applies to men, women, and non-binary folks. And while there isn't one singular definition for magic or witchcraft, one popular definition is that magic is creating change in accordance with our will. In other words, we perform ritual activities in order to effect change in the world around us, change that is in alignment with what we want to see in the world. I'd personally argue that magic is as diverse as the witches who engage with it. Magic can happen with or without the aid of a god or a goddess. Magic can be formal and complex, or casual and simple, and so on. Beyond that, each tradition has their own beliefs and practices surrounding magic, and I don't want to say much more than that just because some traditions are oath-bound, meaning that their practices and beliefs are kept secret from those who don't belong to the tradition. But overall, I think it's important to note that many pagans believe in magic and interact with magic as part of our religious practice. Next, I think it's worth noting that many pagans were not born pagan. Many of us start within another religious tradition, then through research and exploration discover that paganism is a better fit for us. For example, I was raised Christian, and I was a devout, committed Christian at that, but I was always drawn to things involving magic. I knew that a lot of other Christians took issue with magic, but I never understood how something so mysterious and wonderful could be bad. Likewise, even when I was supposed to be monotheistic, it still made sense to me that there were other gods out there. I just figured I wasn't allowed to worship them. Eventually, after a lot of reflection and a lot of research, I discovered that my beliefs align with paganism, but I didn't grow up pagan. And I think that's an important thing to note, because I've engaged in dialogue with people, specifically Christians, who thought that I was pagan because I didn't know about God or Jesus or the Bible. And it kind of took me by surprise, because I went to a Christian school for 13 years. I minored in religion in undergrad. I'm currently in divinity school. I know quite a bit about God and Jesus and the Bible. And if you talk to other pagans, you'll likely find that they have knowledge of other religions as well. Maybe not an extensive knowledge necessarily, but don't be surprised if we know more about other religions than you think. The 8th thing that I want to mention in this video is that most pagans won't try to convert you, and would appreciate it if you didn't try to convert them. As I mentioned just a little bit ago, I discovered paganism through research and exploration and reflection, but at no point did any pagans reach out to me and say, join us. Now that isn't to say that it's impossible that an overzealous pagan might try a little bit too hard to share their religion with you. I'm sure that has happened before. But as a general rule, we don't believe that our path is the only way to connect with the divine, so why force our path on others? And a number of pagans, myself included, don't believe that paganism is the right path for everyone. Religion isn't something that's one size fits all in my opinion, and in my experience, that's a sentiment that's shared throughout the pagan community. And in that spirit, it's generally safe to assume that pagans don't want to be converted to another religion. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of pagans determine that they're pagan after a lengthy process of research and exploration and discovery. And personally speaking, I appreciate it when people respect the work that I've put in by not assuming that I want to leave my religion. And just to be clear, talking about religion is one thing, but trying to convert someone is another thing entirely. The 9th thing I want to mention is that pagans can and do experience discrimination. This can look like people being asked to remove their pentacles at work, despite the fact that crosses are widely considered to be acceptable. This can look like the fact that it wasn't until 2007 that pagans who serve in the US military were allowed to put pentacles on their gravestones. Both of these are things which I learned about in a video on Pagan Prejudice, which I'll leave in the description down below. I've also heard of instances where pagans had their religion weaponized against them in custody battles, where one parent would argue that the pagan parent couldn't possibly be a good parent because of their religion. And also there's the fact that some pagans are afraid to come out of the broom closet, so to speak, because of the fear of being mistreated. Religious discrimination is something that a number of religious minorities experience to varying degrees, so this isn't exclusively a pagan issue, but it definitely is a pagan issue. So if you find yourself in a position to speak out against religious discrimination as a whole, I ask that you remember to include pagans and paganism in your work, as we're overlooked far too often. And lastly, the 10th thing I want to say is that pagans are everywhere. We're people of all races, ethnicities, genders, sexualities, socioeconomic statuses, you name it. We live in big cities, small towns, suburbs, not to mention all around the world. It's not uncommon for people to think of pagans and envision goths and hippies, and while some of us are in fact goths and hippies, many of us are neither. Some of us may be both. Is that possible? I don't know if it's possible. I'd like to think that it's possible. I guess what I'm trying to say is that pagans are diverse. It's the point that I've been making throughout this video, and it's the point that I want to leave off on. So if you're wanting to learn more about paganism, make sure you diversify the teachers you learn from. That's actually something that I'm going to start working on more myself. Anyway, I think that's all I had to say. If you've stuck with me all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you've learned something. If you did, make sure you like this video and subscribe for more educational content just like this. If you have any thoughts or questions, please feel free to leave a comment below, get a conversation started, let's learn together. I also wanted to let you know that Epically Curious now has a Discord server, and I'd love to have you join us there. The link is in the description below. Remember that you're wonderful, and that the world is a better place because you're in it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!